Hello and welcome to the 3D Blu-ray Bunker. This is where I look exclusively at films on 3D Blu-ray, not to do a movie review or to talk about the picture and sound quality, but to focus entirely on the 3D. And this time I'm looking at Black Widow. This is post-converted 3D, of course, and its aspect ratio is predominantly 2.39 to 1, but there are three 1.9 to 1 scenes, which make up just over, I think, about 15% of the film's running time. I know that some projector users really dislike these shifting aspect ratio scenes, and with good reason, but I think a lot more people do like them, so if you're in the majority there, you'll enjoy the fact that getting on for 22 minutes of the film is closer to the same shape as a television. So anyway, Marvel had got to the point where its 3D was very high quality, extremely well done, and I had been mildly concerned about the possibility of them easing off a bit on the expenditure there, with the financial effects of the pandemic and the shift of emphasis towards streaming, not to mention the limited release of its films on 3D Blu-ray, of which this one is a clear example with its current Japanese-only release. But anyway, it's pleasing to see the 3D throughout this film being right up there with Marvel's usual great quality. So for a lot of people, 3D is all about the pop-out, and there's a fair bit of that on show in this film. So most times you see a gun, it's sticking away out of the screen, from a little pistol to a larger rifle. These all make their way out to our side of the screen. Those are two of the more subtle instances of it, but there are sniper rifles that really pop, and not just the silencer, but in these shots, everything from their faces forward is in negative parallax, so that's a whole lot of gun in your face. There was actually one moment where I thought it was maybe a little bit too overt, and perhaps strayed into the arena of gimmicky pop-out, where it's a much wider angle lens, and the silencer is sticking out massively. I mean, it's kind of fun, but it could be seen as a little bit silly. There are a few other things that pop out of the screen in a fairly obvious way, like laser sights sweeping a room, although I do wish they'd held the shot a little bit longer here, and some other stuff with a sword that could also possibly be accused of overdoing it on the 3D front, like here where the blade arcs across the screen, and as it's reaching its most extreme moment of negative parallax, the film goes into slow motion whilst it protrudes at its maximum from the screen, and then it jumps back to normal speed to finish the shot. So again, I think that's another bit that screams 3D at you at a volume that might be just a little bit too unrefined for some people. And there's this bit where the depth of field is so incredibly shallow that I assume they just wanted the focus to be on her eyes, and even then the margins were so tight that they still couldn't quite manage to do that. Maybe old Scarlett missed her mark, which if you're paying an actor $20 million a film, I'd have thought that that's the least that she should be able to do. Anyway, the blade itself is not only massively out of focus, almost to the point of disappearing, but I think there's a little bit too much parallax here, so all in all, despite the extreme pop, I really think this isn't a great 3D shot. But it's not just the obvious stuff that's in front of the screen. The film is absolutely full of things going on in negative parallax, but most of the time in such a way that it doesn't draw attention to itself. It just gets on with putting depth and solidity and space into the view. Like the white truck on the left here is fully in front of the screen, and so's the aeroplane here. And these things aren't just a tiny bit in front of the screen, but quite a reasonable way out. They're just not the kind of things that are more usually associated with the typical pop-out view. One of the more gentle ones is particularly nice, I thought, when she's reaching out here to help someone, extending an arm out of the screen towards us in a moment of tenderness. This is the kind of thing that I think is really effective and properly good 3D. I think it's true to say that pretty much the entire film is very obviously in 3D, and I think I only noticed one shot which lasts for something like a second, and anyway, so when we see someone lying on a flat piece of ground, there's nothing for the 3D to do. But even then, that little bit of structure at the top left there is still clearly in 3D space. So basically, there's not a shot in the film that looks like it's flat. That's with the exception of some bits of video in the opening credits montage, which are 2D. And now that I'm thinking about it, the post-credit sequence is also completely 2D. And it's frankly amazing with some of these Marvel films. When you've sat through 2 hours of strong and solid 3D, to be hit with a couple of minutes at the end of 2D, and its dull flatness suddenly looks like some sort of relic from an obsolete era of filmmaking, but if only that were the case. So whether it was done by design or not, there are a massive number of views throughout the film that absolutely lend themselves to looking lovely in 3D, and it's that sort of corridor type view, or a huge number of variations of it across multiple scales, where 3D can really work wonders. So this view with mirrored lines of perspective on the left and right taking us deep into the screen is used over and over again across various buildings, street views in multiple locations, on large scale buildings, and in much more confined, intimate spaces. It's always letting the 3D establish the view into solid and deep space. Interiors as well as exteriors get the same treatment. It's a constant feast of very nicely composed 3D. It's a similar thing looking down roads with the view stretching back deep into the screen. Basically, any flat plane, whether it's at the bottom, at the sides, or at the top, when it falls back into the frame, I think the 3D can bring such a large amount of atmosphere to the view that's just going to be absent in 2D. I especially like this shot where they're making their way down this track, and the 3D helps to make it feel like they've got a bit of a hike ahead of them. If you want to be critical, there is the odd error here and there, like the reflection on the ground feels like it's painted across the whole surface rather than sitting in its correct space, and even though it passes by very fleetingly, the reflection of the building on the side of the car here is similarly stuck to the car itself, and things like this always have a habit of leaping off the screen as your brain realises that something's not right. I think maybe the best example of that is in this shot. If you look at the rooftop to the left, behind all the washing, there's something that looks a bit like a pallet leaning against the wall, and at the very top of that pallet-like thing there are 3 tiny sections of its structure through which you can see the background beyond the wall. So even though this tiny little bit represents only a microscopic fraction of the whole frame's real estate, as the camera moves across this view and the 3D places that minuscule bit of background in the wrong space, as in it leaves it on the same plane as the palette thing itself, that one irrelevant, teeny-weeny thing just jumps off the screen because our brains are so sensitive to it. But just to be clear, that's absolutely not a complaint, just a small observation. And it's not an error as such, but something that loads of 3D films do is to put the view through a telescopic sight into 3D, and it's not just the crosshairs, but the entire view. So it's incorrect, obviously, but I still quite like it. And there were loads of fairly minor 3D things that I really appreciated, like the heads-up display here sitting in 3D space in a very pleasing way, and I love the way the 3D really works to place this caravan in the middle of nowhere. It's non-flashy 3D, but 3D that does a very good job of adding to the view. There's an interesting thing about those IMAX scenes in these films, well, I think is interesting, and that's that they often get a lot of credit for being particularly great in 3D, which they certainly can be, but at the same time, I think that they can sometimes be less effective in 3D, and that's because they usually use them in movies during a sequence that's on a large scale, and they'll want the view to frequently encompass that epic scale, but in doing so, it means there are going to be quite a few long shots to take it all in, and if you have a long shot like these, then in order for the 3D to be effective and interesting, then it has to go hyper stereo. And in some of these views it does, albeit fairly mildly, although I think my favourite view of this place, funnily enough, is in a non-IMAX shot, where you can very clearly see all of the space in between and beyond the clouds. So this is a long view, but with way beyond natural human vision 3D. A bit that made me chuckle a bit during one of the film's IMAX sequences was when we get a point of view shot from inside the armoured vehicle, and so it briefly becomes what ends up looking like a letterbox shot in a sequence designed to avoid that. They do a superb job with crowd views, or large groups of people, separating every person out into their own very clear and distinct 3D space, and I think that's something that can really help the effect that a film creates when it places its main character in amongst a load of other people, like this. There's some fantastic stuff looking down from high up, always one of 3D's great effective shots, and not just during a major action set piece like this, but just as effective when someone's in a spot of bother and maybe hoping not to fall. There was a sequence where it felt like they missed out on doing that, when the car here is perilously balanced on the bridge, and she's in danger of plunging into the raging rapids below, but we never really get anything like a satisfying view down to show off the danger. On the other hand, there is a very good piece of effective 3D when we see her stuck inside the car, so that's good. There are good views looking up structures that are three-dimensionally very interesting, so this place looks excellent, as well as the view back down it, nicely showing that they weren't going to let a great 3D location go to waste by only getting one view of it. And I love this top-down view, which comes at a point where we know she's about to enter a building where there might be something dangerous inside, so it's a great bit of 3D for heightening tension. And when she goes into the building, the 3D does a really good job in several views of explaining and expanding the depth of the apartment, and therefore sort of emphasizing how there could be danger hiding anywhere and lurking in the shadows. It's all excellent stuff. It sort of feels churlish where the 3D is this good to talk about being disappointed, but there was one shot, which was an important one that's revisited later, and it's a symbolic moment, which was a view of a load of fireflies, and it was a perfect opportunity for a really magical piece of 3D, but unfortunately it just doesn't look anything like as impressive as I'm sure it could have. But great 3D is basically what this film's all about, and it's rammed full of it, so despite its current high Japanese price, which I suspect it might always retain, if you're willing to fork out for a copy, then I'm sure you'll find the 3D worth a bag full of yen. So just a very quick word about the film itself. I've mentioned before that I'm not a heavy-duty Marvel fan, and I don't know the films well enough to know where everything fits in. But even then, this felt to me like a pretty small piece in the overall MCU jigsaw's big picture. I did like the way most of the cast played their parts, although just to demonstrate that I'm not offering up some pro-British bias by saying that I thought Florence Pugh gave the best performance as the most interesting character, which I did, I'll add that I thought Ray Winston was close to being a bit of a joke, a not great performance with what sounded to me like a very lazy attempt at a Russian accent, and a habit of invading the personal space of everyone he spoke to in a way that didn't make him seem unappealing as a character, so much as just unappealing to have Ray Winston breathing down your neck. There were several pretty clearly defined action scenes, which were well done, as CG extravaganzas go, although I didn't really find the secondary antagonist all that interesting, being mute and just pulling all the usual fight moves. I guess it had something to say about family, which played out quite well, but overall I thought it came across as one of the more small-scale MCU films. I'm sure the hardcore fans would get a lot more out of it than I did, but what I'd thought might be a powerful, elegiac piece about the title character ended up coming across as more of just an attempt to introduce her replacement. Most importantly, from this channel's point of view, Black Widow hasn't been the release to break the MCU's long line of 3D Blu-rays, even if it has perhaps made it feel a little bit like the format's being backed into a corner. So I hope you found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you'll join me again soon for a look at another 3D Blu-ray. Until then, thanks for looking in on this one. Cheers for now, bye bye.